I'm Mary Beth Harrison, and I'm a CE instructor.
I'm Lori Selecki. I'm a broker and also an instructor.
My name is Mary Napoleon, and I'm an instructor, and I'm also a broker.
The Forms and Contracts Committee brings you this video series on contracts. We cover the 1 to 4 family, the condo contract, and most of the addendums that we use when we're writing our contracts. We hope this brings some value to you and helps you get through your contracts.
We definitely want to make sure that you understand your first go-to is always your broker. However, at Metrotex, we also want to be a great resource for your education. We are your partner in success.
And remember, the trainings are a resource for you, and your feedback is extremely, extremely important. So please, so that we can raise the bar here at Metrotex, let us know what you think.
We're now going to cover the condo contract. This contract is exactly the same as your 1 to 4 family, except for about 3 or 4 areas which we're going to discuss. Otherwise, you can refer back to the 1 to 4 family video to answer any questions you might have in the rest of the body. Starting with the first paragraph, or the second paragraph, actually, it talks about what exactly is connected to this condo, what's considered part of this property. Well, things like the common area. So there may be 100 units to this condominium, but there are grounds around it. And each of those 100 properties owns a small portion of that land. So it's called common areas. Or maybe there's a pool or tennis courts. That becomes common area for this condominium. But more importantly, it goes on to talk about the parking. It says, specifically assigned to the unit in any other manner, parking areas assigned to the unit are. You want to be as specific as you can possibly be on this so that you know it's parking space 101, then write that down. 2 parking spaces, 101, or 1 covered parking area, 1A, and 1 uncovered parking area, 1A. Whatever that is, at a minimum, you need to say 2 parking spaces, 2 covered parking spaces, whatever is specific to this unit, and especially if it's assigned to the unit. Now, if it's just open park and free for all, you don't have to put anything in there. But when it is specific, because when you bought the condominium, you bought that parking space as well. Moving down to 2B, we talk about declaration, bylaws, and any rules of the association. The buyer, box number 1, has received a copy of the documents. Buyer is advised to read the documents before signing the contract. 2, buyer has not received the copy of the documents. Seller at seller's expense shall deliver the documents to the buyer within blank days. By law, they have 10 days to get this to you. Reality is probably 12 to 15 days is what it takes for an owners association to get all these documents to you. So that you don't have to go back and keep amending the contract, I recommend you put in about 12 to 15 days here. The buyer may cancel the contract before the 6th day after the buyer receives the documents. This is so important here, guys, so listen to this. The only way to terminate a contract in a condominium is by hand delivering or mailing written notice of cancellation to the seller by certified United States mail, return receipt requested. If the buyer cancels the contract pursuant to this paragraph, the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Unlike a 1 to 4 family or a townhome, you can terminate by a different means. It's just a checkbox, it's 1 piece of paper, and you terminate the contract. That is not the case with a condo. When it pertains to homeowner documents, resale certificates, the only way to terminate this contract, hand delivering or mailing, return receipt requested by U.S. mail. Please keep that in mind because it will, when there's nothing else to get you out of a contract and homeowner fees are it, or homeowner documents, you find out you can't have a 40-pound dog and you have a 40-pound dog, then you want to be able to get out of this contract, or you can't park your motorcycle or your RV or whatever it is that's pertinent to your buyer. You really want to pay attention to this paragraph. 2C, the resale certificate from the Condominium Owners Association, is called the certificate. The certificate must be in the form promulgated by TREC or required by the parties. The certificate must have been prepared at the seller's expense no more than 3 months before the date it is delivered to the buyer, and must contain at a minimum the information required by the Texas Property Code. Again, check one box. 1, the buyer's already received the certificate. 2, the buyer has not received the certificate. The seller shall deliver the certificate to the buyer within blank days. Again, 12 to 15 is reasonable here, after the effective date of the contract. The buyer may cancel the contract before the 6th day after the date the buyer receives the certificate. Again, by hand delivering or mailing written notice of cancellation to the seller by certified United States mail, return receipt requested. So whether it's the homeowner documents or the resale certificate that your buyer wants out of this contract, maybe they don't have enough in reserves, or maybe there's a lien that showed up on this and you want to terminate, that's how you will be doing it. If the buyer cancels the contract pursuant to this paragraph, the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. 3, the buyers receive the seller's affidavit that the seller requested the information from the association concerning its financial condition as required by the Texas Property Code, and that the association did not provide the certificate or information required in the certificate. Buyer and seller agree to waive the requirement to furnish the certificate. So you have to agree as the buyer that you're okay moving forward without having the financial information from your association. 2D, if the documents reveal that the property is subject to a right of refusal under which the association or a member of the association may purchase the property, the effective date shall be amended to the date that the buyer receives a copy of the association certificate that 1, the seller has complied with the requirements under the right of refusal, and 2, all persons who may exercise the right of refusal have not exercised or have waived the right to buy the property. If the buyer does not receive the association's certification within so many days after the effective date, or if the right of refusal is exercised, this contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. What does first right of refusal even mean? Some associations, usually a high-rise more than any, that's where I've seen this more than any other place, many high-rises have the first right of refusal, meaning the people who already live there have the right to buy the property first. And they have so many days in their bylaws that they can do that. Usually it takes a board of directors meeting and all kinds of things to make that happen. So when there's a blank there, how long does your buyer want to hang on until the board of directors or this association decides someone can buy it or doesn't buy it? That's up to your buyer. Do they want to hang in for 30 days, 15 days? Do they need a property? They need to be somewhere sooner? That's up to your buyer. So you and your buyer need to have a conversation of how long are you willing to hang out there until this association gets their act together and decides who gets to buy this property. But that's what first right of refusal means. The other part that doesn't change but that you need to be very aware of, and that's under the title policy, the title commitment and the objections. If your buyer is buying this condo as an investment property, meaning their intention was to rent it out, then when you get to objections, which is paragraph 6C, it says objections. Buyer may object in writing to defects, exceptions, or encumbrances to the property other than what was already in the title commitment that they can no longer that they can't take exception to. What you would want to write in here is immediate rental occupation, meaning someone can rent this immediately. Many condominium associations now have bylaws that say that you cannot rent these properties out. It's to keep the ownership integrity of a building. And so if you have an investor, prior to even showing them and getting this far on wanting to write a contract, you should make a phone call to the other agent or the homeowner association and ask the question, do you allow rentals in this condominium building. Moving on to page to 12, settlement and other expenses. 12A3 reads, except as provided by 12A4 below, buyer shall pay any and all association fees or other charges resulting from the transfer of a property not to exceed blank number of dollars, and the seller shall pay the excess. Do not confuse this with homeowner docs. The homeowner documents, it said that we just discussed, were paid by the seller. This is if there is any transfer fee or any association fees. Sometimes they'll charge you like for your mailbox keys or pool keys or changing the gate codes or those kind of things. They're transfer fees. That's what they're talking about here. So is that you can say that the buyer's not going to pay any of it. The seller pays it all. It's all negotiable here. You can do 50-50. I'll pay half of it, the seller pays half of it. Or you'll pay $100 of it or $50 of it and let the seller pay the excess. So that's very negotiable. What is your buyer willing to pay? And again, you might call the homeowner association and find out how much are those fees. What are we talking about? $50, $100? It could be any amount. So those are the major changes to the condo contract that is different from our 1 to 4 family.
One of the addendums that you may have attached to the contract is the addendum for hydrostatic testing. You have that mentioned in paragraph 7. So hydrostatic testing has to have a written permission slip. This is your written permission slip. So hydrostatic testing says you must consult a licensed plumber about the risk associated with the hydrostatic testing before signing this form. Now, the hydrostatic test must be done by a licensed plumber. It cannot be done by your inspector, so don't expect them to do the hydrostatic test during the inspection report. It also says authorization. This is the authorization. Seller is authorizing the buyer at their expense to engage a licensed plumber to perform the hydrostatic test on the property. All right, so the allocation of risk. Now this talks about if something should happen, who's going to pay for that? So it says the seller will pay, or the buyer will pay, or they will share in an amount not to exceed. So there's a cap. Now you might be asking yourself, oh my gosh, what kind of risk could happen? So here's what you need to do. Be the source of the source and not the source itself. You need to contact someone who has that expertise. That's not your area of expertise. So you would need to contact a licensed plumber. Get them to tell you some of the risk and be able to share that with your clients. Another addendum you may want to use is the addendum concerning right to terminate due to the lender's appraisal. This amendment says the following. The financing described in the third-party financing addendum attached to the contract for sale of the above referenced property does not, repeat, does not involve FHA or VA financing. So this is not for FHA or VA. But it gives 3 options for the buyer. The first option is a waiver. It says the buyer feels comfortable about the offer that they've made. And so regardless of what the house appraises for, they are going to pay what they offered. So if the appraisal comes in low, that's okay, they're all in. Now there's also a provision here that says if they agree to that, they must have the money in their bank account to pay that difference. Because it says here, if the lender reduces the amount of the loan due to the opinion of value, aka appraisal, the cash portion of the sale price is increased by the amount the loan is reduced due to the appraisal.
So does this one mean that, say my buyer wanted to go over asking price because we really want this property and there were a whole lot of other people there too. So we went over asking price. Is that when I would use this? If they're willing to pay that no matter what?
Absolutely. So what this says is your buyer tells you, I don't care, we're in it. Yes, we offer it over list because we think it's worth it and we want this house, we don't care. But buyer's agents, beware. Make sure that you have some proof that says they have the cash liquidity to pay that difference, because otherwise you could be setting them up for a default situation. Now let's look at the second paragraph. The second paragraph is a partial waiver. It basically says, you know, I feel pretty good about this offer and I'm willing to step up to the plate with a little bit of money. However, I'm going to put a cap on it. So let's say you offered $400,000 for the house, and you feel really good about it. You're not sure if it's going to appraise, but you hope it will. And if it doesn't, you want to put a cap. So you say, as long as it appraises for, say, $375,000, I have $25,000 I can invest in my own account. So if it comes in at $375,000 or better, I'm still in. But if it comes in at $374,000, I'm out. Now the third is the additional. It says not only in the third-party financing addendum, under paragraph 2B, do I have the right to terminate because it doesn't meet the lender's requirements under the appraisal, but it also says I'm putting an additional right to terminate on there as well. And it says, in addition to the buyer's right to terminate, under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum, the buyer may terminate the contract within blank days after the effective date if, number one, the appraisal value according to the appraisal obtained by the buyer's lender is less than blank. So this gives you a cap. That cap can be anything. It could be $400,000 like you offered. It could be anything below. But you are going to put a monetary number on there. It also says that you will also, as part of this termination option, the buyer will deliver a copy of the appraisal to the seller. So what would you put in this paragraph for the number of days? Buyer's agents, be aware, you've got to allow a third-party lender who you have no control over to give you an appraisal within this timeline. So make sure you run it a few days out because you can't determine when the appraisal is going to be ordered and when you're going to get it. So make sure you protect your buyer. Another addendum you might use is the addendum for backup. Backup contract basically says that your buyer found their dream home. They wanted it so bad and they wrote the offer, but guess what? Somebody beat you to it. So this gives you an opportunity to create a situation for your buyer to be next in line. So if something should happen to that offer, they are the next one to get that home. So the backup contract, this is how that works. There is a paragraph A, and the paragraph A says the contract to which this backup addendum is attached is binding upon execution by the parties, and the earnest money and option fee must be paid as provided in the backup contract. The backup contract is contingent upon the termination of a previous contract, the first contract, dated blank, and this will be a date, for the sale of property. Except as provided by this addendum, neither party is required to perform under the backup contract while it's contingent upon the termination of the first contract. Now, what that means is don't have your buyers do inspections. Don't get them to spend money for surveys. Don't do anything until you step into that first position. Also, in paragraph A, you will probably need to talk to the listing agent to find out what the executed date is for the first contract. And that's the date that you're going to put in paragraph A. Now, paragraph B says if the first contract does not terminate on or before a date, this date can be whatever date your buyer wants to put in there. How long do they want to stay the backup? How long are they willing to wait to be the backup? So you can give a timeline or a drop dead date, if you will, that we're in it until this date, and after that, we're out. And at that point, the backup would terminate, and the earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. The seller must notify the buyer immediately of the termination of the first contract. For purposes of performance, the effective date of the backup contract changes to the date the buyer receives notice of termination of the first contract and thereby becomes the amended date. An amendment or modification to the first one does not negate that first contract. We see in paragraph D that if the buyer has the unrestricted right to terminate, now that we saw that in paragraph 23, right? The option. If they have the right to terminate the backup contract, then the time for giving notice of termination begins on the effective date of this backup contract. It also continues after the amended effective date and ends upon the expiration of the buyer's unrestricted right to terminate the backup contract. E says, for purposes of this addendum, time is of the essence. There's that time is of the essence again. Strict compliance with the times for performance stated herein is required. Then both buyer and seller have to sign this. Here's what this really means. Number one, you're going to need to talk to the listing agent. Find out the dates that the first contract has actually been effective. That date you'll put in A. Then you can have a timeline for them to stay with it until they become primary. When it talks about the amended effective date, that's the date that the seller actually notifies you, hey, guess what? You are in position 1. We have terminated the first contract and you are it. That amended effective date starts your secondary timeline. So all the timelines from the contract will recalibrate, boom, start on that effective date. So your option, all the other timelines will start from that date. Be sure, again, that you don't spend money while you are in the backup position. Do not have inspections done, surveys, etc. Spend no money for your buyer until you become primary. The seller's notice to the buyer for the removal of contingency under addendum for backup contract. If you had a backup, this is the notice that you listing agents will need to make sure your sellers fill out and deliver to the buyer's agent to let the backup know, guess what? We now are out of contract with the first one and you guys are in first position. So it says here, in accordance with the backup contract, the seller notifies buyer that the first contract is terminated. The contract with the buyer is no longer subject to the contingency described in the addendum. And the effective date of the contract is now amended to, and this is going to be the date the notice was sent to the buyer. And this becomes your new amended effective date. Don't forget, all your timelines in the contract will start then. So it recalibrates and starts running through.
So the next form we're going to talk about is the third-party financing addendum. This form and this addendum actually accompanies the contract. So in paragraph 1 of this, we talk about the type of financing and the duty to apply and obtain approval. One of the most important things I want you to remember in this paragraph is it explains that the buyer shall apply promptly for all financing described below and make every reasonable effort to obtain financing. So this is where it's really important that we explain to the buyer, first of all, we should have them approved already at this point. However, we want to make sure that we stay on top of them because when we get through this addendum, you will see that there are timelines affiliated with their approval. So when we talk about the different type, the first is conventional. And for the most part, all of them will pretty much look the same, but we're going to start out with this one, making sure that the principal amount should be the amount from paragraph 2B of the contract. And then when we talk about the for the first X number of years, that's generally 30 years in that paragraph. Also, the interest rate and some of the other things that come out of this always refer back to the lender approval or the lender pre-qualification letter. We also talk about buyer's loan estimates for a loan not to exceed. Generally, you can up that about 0.5% just in case the interest rate adjusts during your time period. And then when it talks about that second paragraph on 2, where it says, if there's a second loan only, should you fill this out? And if there's a second loan, again, that's generally going to be about 30 years. And then on that origination charges, generally about 1 to 2%. You can't go wrong in that area. So that's conventional, and for the most part, whatever you put in that one will flow to each of the lending types, but wherever it differs, I'll talk about that. The next one is B, where we talk about Texas veteran loans. For the most part, that looks the same. It's pretty clear cut. No big major announcements in that one. When we talk about the FHA insured financing, where it talks about the loan type, here is generally going to always be a 203B, which is the most common FHA loan. I don't want to get into the other loan types. Just know that you really should refer back to your lender if it is not your basic 203B loan. The next one is where we talk about the VA guaranteed financing. And this one, VA makes it very simple. How much and how long? And that's all you need to worry about in that category. Then we have USDA, pretty much the same. Reverse mortgage is probably one of the areas that is going to be the most difficult. We highly recommend that you talk to the lender and you have the lender not only to explain what needs to go in this paragraph, but to explain all the education around this particular loan before you draw up the contract. The next area of the third-party financing addendum is paragraph 2, where we talk about approval of financing. This is probably one of the more important paragraphs in the third-party financing addendum because it talks about the buyer approval and the property approval. So let's focus on the buyer approval. In this section, we have the ability to put the number of days we think it's going to take for the lender to approve this buyer. 21 days is generally ample time for any lender to get that buyer approved. However, you should check with your lender prior to putting that number in there to make sure that they can meet that guideline. Also, it is extremely important to realize that if for any reason they miss this timeline, your client will actually pretty much void out their earnest money and will not get their earnest money back. So please make sure that you pay attention to that timeline. Our next approval is the property approval. This section is equally important because this is where it talks about making sure that the appraisal comes in, but I want to read just one line that's very important. Buyer, not later than 3 days before the closing date, may terminate this contract by giving the seller notice of termination and a copy of the written statement for the lender setting forth the reasons. So this is all talking about making sure that this property meets all of the lender guidelines, one of the most important being the appraisal in this one. But again, it says buyer does not terminate under this paragraph. Property approval is deemed to have been obtained. So under buyer approval, it's extremely important that you realize if for any reason you miss that date or that timeline that you put in that blank, then your buyer's earnest money is non-refundable at that time. The next area we're going to talk about is 2B of the third-party financing addendum, where we talk about property approval. Now, in this paragraph, it's very important. It says, if buyer's lender determines that the property does not satisfy lender's underwriting required repairs, buyer not later than 3 days before the closing date may terminate this contract. But also important, I want you to understand that that talks about the appraisal. It talks about the insurability of the property and, again, any type of lender repairs. So this is extremely important that we remember that part as well. And then C, which is bolded for a reason. Anytime you see something bolded, it wants us to pay extreme attention to it. It says time is of the essence for this paragraph and strict compliance with the time frame for performance is required. Then paragraph 3 talks about just security. It says each note for the financing described above must be secured by a vendor's lien and a deed of trust on the property. So that's pretty standard verbiage. The next paragraph is paragraph 4, where we talk about FHA and VA required provisions. It's one of the longer paragraphs, but one of the most important things we want you to remember on this is where it asks for that dollar amount, it's looking for the sales price, which would come off of the contract in area, it's going to be the 3C is where you're going to get that number from for the sales price, okay? It also explains in this paragraph in a nutshell that if the property does not appraise, it doesn't meet the lender guidelines. So again, this kind of protects you as far as the appraisal is concerned, and there's no need for the appraisal addendum. Area 5 is where it talks about authorization to release the information. This is probably the one area where most of us overlook it. A really states that this basically relating to the status of the approval for financing, and it talks about the lender and the buyer and the seller shall furnish this information. And then B gives the ability for them to give us a copy of the closing disclosure and the settlement statement. So it's very important that we remember those things. And then, of course, your signatures finalizes this document. The next addendum is the seller's invitation to buyer to submit a new offer. This form is also known as the 1926 form, a TAR form. This form should be used in the event that you get multiple offers from different buyers, or you get a single offer from different buyers, and you want to have the ability to negotiate without feeling like you're being thrown into a counter situation. Because on this form, you basically can go in and you can tell all of the parameters that you'd like for that buyer's agent to change, but clearly on paragraph 3, it explains this communication and invitation is not a counteroffer. The property remains on the market and seller may consider other offers and accept another offer. So I love this form because it gives you the ability to go back and forth with negotiations without commitment.
So let's say I have multiple offers. Do I send this to all of the offers or just the one we really want to work? How does that work?
So basically with this form, you send this to the offer or offers that you'd like to work, but you do not have to send it to everyone, only the ones that you want to work. Our next addendum is addendum for seller's disclosure of information on lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards as required by federal law, also known as the TAR Form 1906. One of the most important things we need to remember about this form is that any property prior to 1978, we have to have one of these forms completed. And it explains in paragraph A the entire lead warning statement. B is where we, if you have the seller, where the seller has the ability to make their disclosure. If they know that there's issues of lead-based paint, they disclose it here. If they do not know, then they basically say seller has no knowledge. Also under this paragraph 2 is where the seller would disclose any type of reports that they may have on this property if they have it. If they don't, simply say seller has no reports. Then under paragraph C is where the buyer has a right to, 1, either waive their ability to check and see if there's lead-based paint, or 2, they can actually do an assessment. But they have within 10 days after the effective date of the contract to do this. Also in paragraph D, this is where the buyer acknowledges whether he or she has received copies of the Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. So it's very important that we make sure that they acknowledge whether they've received it or not. Paragraph E is also where the brokers has to acknowledge this form and that they have communicated all of the information to their clients. And then of course you have your certification of accuracy. Probably some of the more important things about this form is during the listing or at listing time, this form should be dated at that time, okay? And the seller and listing broker should sign it. The buyer should sign this form once they actually complete the contract, and also the buyer's agent at that time. And that's everything about lead-based paint. The next form is our intermediary relationship notice, which is also known as the TAR 1409. Now this form, I want to go back and remind you that in the beginning we give them information about brokerage services, which explains how agency works in Texas, and it explains to them the whole process of intermediary. Once you get the buyer's representation agreement signed, you also ask their permission about intermediary at that time, and if you're on the listing side, we also ask their permission to work intermediary at that time. So that is when they first agree to it. Once we get to the contract stage, and now that buyer has agreed to purchase a home listed by your firm or by you, now we will use this form because we are in an intermediary situation. The most important thing I want you to understand on this form is paragraph D, where it says the broker will or the broker will not appoint licensed associate to communicate with, carry out instructions of, and provide opinions and advice during negotiations to each party. If broker makes such appointments, broker appoints the following. Either your name is going to appear in both of those blocks, or it's going to be your name and another agent's name. But the only person that can appoint intermediary is the broker. Also, when we talk about just the acknowledging receipt of this notice and the undersigned parties, just making sure that everyone has received this form and they have a final opportunity to say yes or no to intermediary. So For a small brokerage firm where she only has one agent, or she may have a couple, either the broker has to work both sides of that transaction, or the broker has to give away both sides and have an agent on each side, or that same agent now would represent both clients. But you cannot be the broker to oversee this whole transaction and represent. You can't do both. Our next form is our notice of withdrawal of offer. Now, this form is extremely important when you have sent an offer over and you've changed your mind, or you have countered, whether you are the buyer or seller. This form can work for either or. Now, this is also important because if you remember our seller's invitation form, that form does not get you in the situation where you have to withdraw the offer. But if for some reason you go ahead and you send a counter offer, this form will protect you from that seller executing that contract at a later date or the buyer executing that contract at a later date. And that is the TAR 1945 form.
Now we're going to talk about an amendment. An amendment goes on top of your contract. Once you go under contract, you never go back and touch that contract. You have a legal binding document. An amendment does just that. It says, I want to amend something inside of the contract. And this one gives you 9 different ways that you might, or things that you might commonly amend on a contract. So let's just start off with seller and buyer amend the contract as follows. Check each applicable box. 1. The sales price in paragraph 3 of the contract is the cash portion, the sum of all financing, and the sales price. Well, let's just use for an example, we had a $100,000 sales price, and the lender said, you know, this house appraised for so much higher, let's raise the price to $103,000 and let's have them pay some of our closing costs. That might be one example. Or let's say that we've done inspections and there was $2,000 worth of repairs that needed to be done. Maybe we take that $100,000 and we lower the price by those $2,000. So that might be a reason that the price would change during the transaction, in which case all 3 lines might change. So that's your reason to be changing a price. 2 is the one we use most on an amendment, and it reads, in addition to any repairs and treatments otherwise required by the contract, seller at seller's expense shall complete the following repairs and treatments. What's going to go in this line is after you do inspections, anything that you would like the seller to address needs to go here. Well, this line's not very long. There's not a lot of space there. So I suggest at this point you go to a Word document and you type out each item. Rather than having a running long sentence that you can't tell when one starts and one stops, the best way to do this is 1, repair or replace the disposal. 2, repair and replace the rotted wood on the northeast corner, for examples, right? So you want to be very specific about what you want done here. Whether you want it just repaired, do you want it repaired and replaced, do you just want it replaced? What are the issues here? What we're not looking for are cosmetics. When you walked in and you saw that the paint was chipped in a corner of the living room, you're not asking them to do cosmetics here. You're asking them to repair systems and things that do not work in the house. Air conditionings, water heaters, roofs, that type of thing. That's what we're looking for here. It's up to you if you want to send the inspection report, but I will tell you that if you're going to be asking for repairs here, it's very difficult for the seller to comprehend what you're talking about if you don't, at a minimum, send the pages that go along with these specific repairs. So that would be my suggestion, that you do at least that. And the more you can put in here, maybe refer back to page 4 of the inspection report so that they know exactly where to go to. Anything you can do to help the other agent get the seller to agree to this, that's what needs to happen here. And this is as negotiable as the contract is. The seller may come back and say, I'll do 1 through 3, but I'm not doing 4 and 5. It goes back to the buyer, and the buyer decides, do we do that or not? Now, one more thing to understand. The option period is paragraph 23. The inspection is paragraph 7. They're nowhere near together on the contract. it would be the smart thing to do is to have your inspections during the option period. Do you have to? Absolutely not. You can do inspections the day before closing. It's a little silly, but you could. So most of us do our inspections during that option period. It's the main reason that most buyers are going to terminate. It's because way too much showed up on the report, or they gave the laundry list to the seller and the seller said no, and the buyer can't afford to do them or chooses not to do the repairs. So a lot of things can go on here. This is kind of a moving target, but paragraph 2 is really important and the most we use when we use an amendment. But let's continue. Paragraph 3, the date in paragraph 9 of the contract is changed to. Well, that's our closing date. If you're going to close early, you don't need to do anything, because if you remember in the contract, it said closing would be on or before a certain date, right? This would be if the closing was not going to happen on time. So we were supposed to close on June 20th, and the lender, or for whatever reason, the buyer cannot close. They're going to be out of the country. Whatever the reason, you're going to want to extend the closing date so that the buyer and seller agree. Now, does the buyer and seller have to agree? No, they don't. The buyer can say, I need this, but the seller can say no, and then we go back to the original contract. And everyone's going to have to figure out how that'll happen. So closing early, not an issue. Let me give you another example. The buyer is going to be leaving the country, and he needs to close early. That's a different conversation. Now we really do want to amend this because we need the seller to agree to also close early. Maybe we add a lease back. There's different things that can happen here. So if it's an I've got to close early, we want to write it down. If we have to close late, we must write it down, or the buyer could be in default for not showing up for closing. Number 4, the amount in paragraph 12A 1B of the contract is changed to. That refers back to closing cost assistance. So again, let's just say we did our inspections and repairs came to $3,000. We had bids and that's what it is. So you might go back and say, you know what, seller, I don't want you to do anything. I'm going to do all of the repairs. I need you to give me $3,000 for those repairs. Well, that's not legal. They can't just hand you money. That's our loans won't allow that. Our lenders won't allow that. So the clean way to do that is to have the seller pay the buyer's closing cost in lieu of repairs. So that's what would happen here. 5, the cost of lender repairs and treatments as itemized on the attached list will be paid as follows. The seller will pay some, the buyer will pay some. Maybe the seller pays it all. That's what the buyer wants. Maybe the buyer pays it all. It's negotiable here. So for example, let's say that the FHA loan came back and said you have to paint the side of the garage that's got flaking paint and whatever they need you to do. That would be what would show up here. So the lender's saying, I cannot loan on this house unless these things are done. I will tell you that FHA and VA are the 2 loans that might happen on. Conventional, it's not very often that we have lender required repairs, so we find that more in the governmental loans. 6, the buyer has paid the seller an additional option fee of blank number for an extension of the unrestricted right to terminate the contract on or before 5 p.m. on what date? The additional option fee will or will not be credited to the sales price. So let's say we've done our inspections and we find out that we're questioned about the roof. We've had so many, we have storms and maybe there's hail damage, maybe there's not, but we need a roofer out there. The air conditioning is having some problems. We need to have an air conditioning man look at it. So we need more information. We've got a willing buyer, we've got a willing seller. Let's make some informed decisions here. So our option period is towards the end. We can't get a roofer there till, say, 2 days later. We're going to want to have everyone agree to extend the option period. Please note, guys, this is not a wink wink, we're going to give you $1. That's not how this goes. If you don't give them some kind of consideration or a dollar amount, there is no option. That happens both in the contract and it's the same issue right here. So is $1 reasonable? No, I will tell you that it's not. And if you went to a court of law, I think the judge would look at you and go, yeah, I don't think $1 is a reasonable amount to put in for option. $5, $10, is that a big deal for a buyer to come up with? No. So, and also understand that you may have sent the laundry list, as I call it, of repairs needed to the seller. Maybe the seller needed more time, but it's the buyer's responsibility to pay the money to extend the option. Whether it seems fair or not is irrelevant. It's the buyer that gives the money to the seller to extend an option period. And again, you want to buy the house, so why not give them the time to get the information to make some informed decisions here? 7, buyer waives the unrestricted right to terminate this contract for which the option fee was paid. So let's say we had a 8-day option period and we got to have the inspections in the first 2 days and the house inspected great, and we're willing to take that away. We're willing to say, okay, we waive the unrestricted right. We want to move on. That's great for both parties, and that's certainly possible. 8, the date for the buyer to give written notice to seller that buyer cannot obtain buyer approval as set forth in the third-party financing is changed to. If you remember, in third-party finance, we had to give a date specific, a time specific, to get buyer approval for the loan. So again, let's use 21 days. We get halfway through the loan process of those 21 days, and the lender quits his job. We lose that lender, and things are just getting bogged down, and we need to change lenders. That's a good reason to go into the seller and go, look, we just need a little more time. We're going to a new lender. Everything looks good, but we have to start the process over again. So that would be the reason to extend it, because if you remember, once that time period in your seller finance goes away, it's over. You don't get an extension unless you do it this way. The last item on the amendment is number 9, and it just says other modifications. So what goes in there? Well, let's say, for example, there's a residential lease attached to this contract, and you were supposed to close on June 20th, and you were going to lease it back till June 23rd. Well, for some reason, the closing got extended, and we did the amendment to extend the closing till June 23rd, but we need to extend the lease till June 26th. So that might be one reason. Maybe we couldn't get clear title, and there's some things that the title company needed to do, so we extended time for them to clear the issues in the title. Various reasons that need to happen in here that are in our contracts that are date specific. Most of them are covered in 1 through 8, but there's a few there that kind of are outstanding, and those may be 2 examples. What I find is probably the best suggestion here when you're using an amendment is for each thought that you need or each request that you have, you put it on a separate amendment. And if you look on zip forms, you'll see amendment 1, 2, 3, 4. You can go back and use them again and again. You don't have to just do those 4. Let's say you wanted to ask for repairs and you had your laundry list there and you needed to extend the closing. Well, if you put them both on one amendment, the seller might have agreed to extend the contract, but they said no to some of your repairs, so now they've said no to everything, right? So put your extended closing date on one amendment. Put your repair request on another amendment. If they decide they would rather have closing cost instead of repairs, that goes on yet another amendment. So each thought or request goes on a different amendment. That's my suggestion to you, rather than cramming all the things in one and standing a chance of them saying no to everything. The next forms we're going to talk about are our least favorite because they deal with termination of contracts, and none of us want that after we've put all this work into it. The first one is notice of buyer's termination of contract, and it talks about the property address and the buyer and the seller. Buyer notifies seller that the contract is terminated pursuant to the following. I call this the 8 ways to leave your lover. So, 1, the unrestricted right of buyer to terminate the contract under paragraph 23 of the contract. So that's your option period. So let's say you had 8 days for the option period, and on the 7th day, you just decided you don't want this house. It doesn't really matter why. You don't like the doorbell, the inspections were too much. It doesn't matter. You do not owe the seller an explanation. You just get to check this box, sign it, and you're done, if it's before your option period ends at 5 p.m. 2, buyer cannot obtain buyer approval in accordance with third-party financing addendum to the contract. Remember when we talked about third-party finance, there was a date in there to have the buyer's creditworthiness achieved. I think we talked about 21 days. Well, on the 18th day, the buyer loses their job. And so there's no way they're going to get a loan now. You check this box and you're out of there. You didn't get financing, you couldn't be approved, you're done. Maybe just the lender had reasons why you couldn't get it, in which case the lender could write a letter saying you were not approved. Nonetheless, you check this box. 3, the property does not satisfy the property approval in accordance with third-party financing addendum to the contract. Buyer has delivered to the seller lender's written statement setting forth the reason or reasons for the lender's determination, in which case maybe it was appraisal, maybe it was lender required repairs. For whatever reason, the property did not approve. Remember, there were 2 approvals, the buyer's creditworthiness and the house. So in this case, it was the house. 4, buyer elects to terminate under paragraph A of the addendum for property subject to mandatory membership under the Property Owners Association. So we're going to talk about the Property Owners Association addendum, but let's just say that when you get the homeowner docs, you realize that you can't park your RV there, or your boat, or you can't have a dog over 30 pounds and your dog is 50 pounds. Those would be reasons for you to terminate under the homeowners association, any documents. Maybe their reserves aren't high enough and you aren't happy with their financials. Whatever the reason, you have so many days under the addendum for the owners association. If you remember, that was 3 days once you receive the documents to respond, and this is how you would respond. We're not happy, we're ready to terminate because of that. If you remember, don't want you to be confused here. If you're selling a condo, remember this is not how you get out of a condo based on homeowner association. If you remember, that was before the 6th day. It had to be hand delivered or U.S. mail return receipt requested. That's the only way to get out of a condo for the homeowner association. So don't mix those 2 up. This is for single family or townhomes. Under 5, buyer elects to terminate under paragraph 7B2 of the contract relating to the seller's disclosure notice. If you remember when we went through the contract, you either had received the seller's disclosure prior to writing the contract, which is our choice. We'd love to have that happen. But let's just say you didn't get it, and we asked for it to be delivered in 7 days. But it didn't get delivered until the 8th or 9th day. The buyer can terminate under that paragraph all the way through until closing. So we really don't want that to happen. It's incumbent on the listing agent to get that seller's disclosure to the buyer immediately. And they should be getting that at the listing anyway, so that this doesn't happen. But you can see how a buyer could read the seller's disclosure and realize, wow, there's something in there I didn't foresee and I don't want to move forward. This is the way to do that. 6, buyer elects to terminate under paragraph 3 of the addendum concerning right to terminate due to lender's appraisal. Buyer has delivered a copy of the appraisal to the seller. Now, we had 2 different issues there. If you remember a few up, under 3, the property didn't meet lender's underwriting requirements. And that could be anything from title to insurance to whatever. There's many things that a lender needs to have the property approved for. Appraisal's one of them, but it has its own line here. So if the property did not appraise, the lender must give that appraisal to the buyer, and the buyer must give it to the seller. That's the only way to get out under this paragraph, is that it gets delivered. 7, buyer elects to terminate under 6D of the contract. 6C for residential condominium contracts. So we can use this one for a condo, because timely objections were not cured by the end of the cure period. So this deals with your title policies, a survey, also under a normal contract under a 1 to 4 family. But typically this is anything to do with the title commitment. 8, other. So what might go here? What didn't we cover? Well, there were other things in the contract that, if you remember, said if this doesn't happen, the buyer, as his sole remedy, may terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. That's what would go in here. Anything that was not covered in 1 through 7, but gave you that option in the contract, then you're going to be writing it in here. Understand, the best thing about this form is there's only one signature needed, and that's the buyer. The seller has no rights here. The buyer has all the say if you've complied with the contract. And if you have, you fill this out, the buyer signs it, you hand it in a timely manner to the seller, and you're done, right? At this point, once you go under contract, just remember you have an equitable interest in this property. And so you have some rights here. This one's a fairly new form, and this is notice of seller's termination of the contract. Now, there's not many rights in this contract for the seller. Most of the rights fall to the buyer. However, it says seller notifies buyer that the contract is terminated pursuant to the following. 1, buyer failed to deliver the earnest money within the time required under paragraph 5 of the contract and before the time seller provided this notice to the buyer. If you remember when we went over the contract, you had to deliver the earnest money within 3 days of effective date of the contract. And our days are running days. There's no such thing as a business day. So, went under contract Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, you have to have your earnest money there. If you don't, the seller may terminate the contract. And certainly before you get the earnest money there if you're late with it. 2 is other. Again, there's not many reasons that the seller has the right to terminate. However, if there is a time for performance, and you remember time is of the essence, there were several times in the contract that verbiage was used, meaning there's no wiggle room. That's your date. It's a drop dead date. And so that would give the seller the ability to put you in default and terminate the contract. This notice is not an election of remedies. Release of the earnest money is governed by the contract. And as always, consult an attorney before signing. TREC rules prohibit real estate license holders from giving legal advice. Read this form carefully. The last way to get out of a contract is just flat release of earnest money. This gets used when there are no more outs in the contract. Let's say we're 2 weeks before closing, we've done all of our financing, we've done all the option periods, title work's been done. There are no more outs in this contract. There's nothing to get anybody out on. This is what has to be used at that point. The earnest money is released between the undersigned buyer and seller concerning the property, and you have your property address in there. Notice, this form provides for the release of the parties, brokers and title companies, from all liability under the contract, not just dispersing the earnest money. Do not sign this form if it is not your intention to release all persons signing this form from all liability under the contract. Read this release carefully, in bold. If you do not understand the effect of this release, consult your attorney before signing. A, the undersigned buyer and seller release each other, any broker, title company, and escrow agent from any and all liability under the aforementioned contract. B, the undersigned directs, and you put the title company name in here. So whatever title company is on page 1, that's the title company name that would go in here. They direct the escrow agent to disperse the earnest money as follows. So this gets filled out. Let's say we gave them $1,000 earnest money, and the buyer feels very strongly that they should get this money back. It's their money, they should get it back. So the buyer writes $1,000 in there, and they write to buyer. And the buyer signs it, and notice that the agents must sign this form as well. This is not just signed by a buyer. This needs a buyer agreement and a seller agreement. We've now created a little bit of a contentious situation here. So we send this immediately to the notices page, to the other agent, and to the seller that you are wanting to release the earnest money. And the seller comes back and says, yep, I agree, you should get the earnest money back, and they sign it and we're done. That's a good day. Doesn't usually go that way, because who thinks they should be getting their earnest money back, right? So the seller comes in here and says, no way that buyer's getting this. So they come in and they scratch out the buyer, and they go to the next line. You notice there are 4 lines there, and they write $1,000 goes to the seller, and they send it back around again. And the buyer goes, no, not doing this. And now the argument starts, right? So there's a whole ping pong match that goes on here, and it's in your contract under escrow towards the back of the contract of the rules of how this game is played and the demands that can be made. But at this point, the fight is on. I strongly suggest at some point that cooler heads prevail and maybe you split that money. Maybe that's a solution. But at the end of the day, this can go on for years. This can sit at the title company for a really long time. And ultimately, the money will go to the state of Texas, where they will hold it. So all this does is kind of messes up the title company's bookkeeping for a while everyone's fighting over this. But there's no right or wrong here. And do not ever tell your buyer, oh, you will definitely get your earnest money back. Because the reality is, after a point in the contract, this is a fight, guys. There's no right or wrong here. It's just who feels like they have been wronged. The sellers had their house off the market, so they're not a happy camper, and the buyer's not a happy camper because something made them want to walk away towards the end of this contract. So this one is a bouncing ball. It can go on and on and on, but that's how that's used and when this form is used. We're going to talk about seller's temporary residential lease. If your seller is going to stay in the house 1 hour after you have closed and funded, you need to be using this residential lease. Otherwise, you've invited them to stay in your home and you can't get them out for any reason. They're a guest in your home. So this is a legal binding document that just cleans up an otherwise very messy situation and puts some teeth in it and the what ifs and what happens. So let's go over the seller's temporary lease and just know that it cannot last for any longer than 90 days. So this isn't meant to be a long-term lease. This is meant to be kind of a stopgap between the closing and the seller being able to move out. And there's many reasons to use this form. Just trying to close and move everybody on one day sometimes gets to be very problematic. And if you have multiple closings, so house A has to close and house B has to close and house C has to close before this one can close, you can see that that domino effect is a problem. Everyone cannot get up and levitate and move on the same day. We're going to have to give some leeway here to give people time to make some moves. So that's a good reason to use this. The parties to the lease are landlord is now the buyer. So I always jokingly say you've now become the landlord, and the seller is now the tenant. Lease, number 2. Landlord leases to tenant the property described in the contract between landlord and buyer and tenant and seller, known as, and you have the property address in here. 3. The term. The term of the lease commences, it starts on the date the sale covered by the contract is closed and funded. Big word to listen to. Not just signed, but funded. And terminates on blank, unless terminated earlier by reasons of other provisions. So again, let's just use the example. We closed on June 20th, and you want to let the seller stay there for a couple of days to be able to move. So you would be putting maybe the 22nd or 23rd on there. Another good way to do this is just say 2 days after close, just 2 days, right? So they can stay there for 2 days or 3 days or 5 days. And that way that date roams. If the closing changes, then that date just kind of keeps floating. So that's not a bad way to do it. You can also put a timestamp on that. So maybe if you're fighting between the buyer and seller, I want the weekend, no, I want the weekend, maybe you give the seller till Saturday at noon, and then you give the buyer from noon on, right? So there's ways to work this. So you can say you want this to terminate on June 23rd at 5 p.m. The buyer wants the house when they get off work that day. You can be very specific about this, or you can leave it a little open-ended saying 2 days. If you do have it open-ended, know that it goes to 11:59 p.m. on that date, right? So they have the whole day. So effectively, your client would get it the next morning. So that's on the terms. Rental. Tenant shall pay to landlord as rental blank number of dollars per day, excluding the day of closing and funding, with the full amount of rental for the term of the lease to be paid at the time of funding of the sale. The tenant will not be entitled to a refund of the rental if this lease terminates early due to tenant's default or voluntary surrender of the property. So how much gets paid there? Well, again, everything's negotiable. I often will just put PITI and let the title company figure out what the daily rate is. So your principal, interest, taxes, and insurance payment for the buyer gets divided by 30 days, and each day gets multiplied by, say they're staying 10 days. That's the amount. Or you can decide that it's $100 a day, $50 a day, whatever. It can be whatever the buyer is okay with. That's what goes in this amount. Deposit. Tenant shall pay to landlord at the time of funding of the sale, blank as a deposit to secure performance of this lease by tenant. Landlord may use the deposit to satisfy tenant's obligation under this lease. Landlord shall refund any unused portion of the deposit to the tenant with an itemized list of deductions from the deposit within 30 days after the tenant surrenders the possession of the property, or B, provides landlord with written notice of tenant's forwarding address. The two issues here, they have to give a forwarding address for them to be able to send the money. And as the landlord, who was our buyer, as the landlord, let's say they felt like the house needed to be cleaned, the carpets had to be cleaned, whatever, they have to show receipts of how they spent that money. So let's say we got $1,000 of a deposit, you have to show them why you're not giving them $1,000 back. You have to be very specific about that and what those costs were for you to get this house back to the way it was. Utilities. Tenant shall pay all utility charges except. So unless there's something that the new buyer would want to have started early, that's what would go in there. But basically, the tenant is going to be keeping, the old seller, the tenant is going to be keeping all of the utilities that they already had. They're just going to keep them running, right? 7, use of property. Tenant may use the property only for residential purposes. Tenant may not assign this lease or sublet any part of the property. Can't turn it into a business, can't change any of that. 8, pets. Tenant may not keep pets on the property except, well, when you're writing this, when you showed the property, you saw a dog and a cat. So you just may put in here dog and cat, or pets already on property. You can put it that way if you want, but you just list out the pets, or general, you can keep pets on there. 9, condition of property. The tenant accepts the property in its present condition and state of repair at the beginning of this lease. Upon termination, the tenant shall surrender the property to the landlord in the condition required under the contract, except normal wear and tear and any casualty loss. Alterations. Tenant may not alter the property or install improvements or fixtures without prior written consent of the landlord. Any improvements or fixtures placed on the property during the lease become the property of the landlord. Special provisions. There's a lot of different things that can go in here. Now again, our job is not to be an attorney, and our job is not to make things up and write it. However, if your buyer is concerned that the property be left, for example, clean, so you might say home to be professionally clean, or maybe they had pets and you wanted the carpets cleaned, home to be professionally cleaned and carpets cleaned. So that may be something you put in there. Different reasons to have some special provisions in there. But again, the space is not very big, and it's not our job to make things up to go in there. 12, inspections. Landlord may enter at reasonable times to inspect the property. Tenant shall provide the landlord door keys, access codes, and allow access to the property during the term of this lease. Now, when a lease is only 2 or 3 days, the chances of you needing to get in there are not great. But let's say it is a 20 or 30 day, 2-month lease back. You might need to get in there. You might want to start doing some repairs. You might, different reasons. You might need to go in there and measure some things so you can be ready to go when you do move in. This is saying that they have to provide you with keys to that house and let you in at reasonable times. 13, laws. The tenant shall comply with all applicable laws, restrictions, ordinance, rules, and regulations with respect to the property. 14 is underlined. Again, they want your attention. This is the one that probably starts to cause a little bit of trouble here. Repairs and maintenance. Except as otherwise provided in this lease, the tenant shall bear the expense of repairing and maintaining the property, including but not limited to the yard, trees, shrubs, unless otherwise required by the Texas Property Code. Tenant shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act or admission of the tenant or any persons other than the landlord, landlord's agents, or invitees. So basically, while the seller, now the tenant, is living in the house, should something break, they are going to be responsible for fixing it. It goes on to say, 15, indemnity. Tenant indemnifies landlord from the claims of all third party for injuries or damage to persons or property, or of such third party arising from the use or occupancy of the property by the tenant. This indemnification includes attorney fees, costs, and expenses incurred by landlord. So someone falls on the property and breaks a leg, you can't go back and sue the landlord, right? Both parties need to keep insurance on the property while you're living there. And that next line actually talks about that, insurance. Landlord and tenant shall each maintain such insurance on the contents and the property as each party may deem appropriate during the term of this lease. Note, in bold, consult your insurance agent. Possession of property by seller as tenant may change insurance policy coverage. It's really important. The buyer really can't close without insurance because the lender won't allow it. So we know that they have insurance on the property, but the seller remaining there as a tenant also should keep insurance on the property. 17, default. If tenant fails to perform or observe any provisions of this lease and fails within 24 hours after notice by landlord to commence and diligently pursue to remedy such failure, tenant will be in default. 18, termination. This lease terminates upon expiration of the term specified in paragraph 3 or upon tenant's default under this lease. A lot of people have come, say, from apartments or a rental situation where once the lease runs out, it turns into a month-to-month situation. So a lot of us are very familiar with that. What this lease is saying is that when this lease is over, the termination date that we already established, it's over. We're done. We don't want you to stay. Me as the new buyer wants my house, right? And we need you, seller, to get out. That's what this lease does. It's kind of starting to hold everyone's feet to the fire and put some teeth into an otherwise invitation to stay in the home. 19, holdover. Tenant shall surrender the possession of the property upon termination of this lease. Any possession by tenant after termination creates a tenancy at sufferance and will not operate to renew or extend this lease. Tenant shall pay blank number of dollars per day during the period of any possession after termination as damages, in addition to any other remedies which the landlord is entitled to. This holdover fee should be pretty severe. You want the Holiday Inn to start looking better than your house. So you want this to be $100, $200 a day. And if it's a big house, lot of square footage, you may be putting $500 to $1,000 a day in here. You want this to be enough that at the end of this period, the seller gets out. Bottom line, get out of my house. That's what we're saying here. 20, attorney fees. The prevailing party in any legal proceedings brought under or with respect to this lease is entitled to recover from the non-prevailing party all cost of such proceedings and reasonable attorney fees. The rest of this absolves you as the new landlord of tenant laws. There's certain things as renter, as owner of rental property, that the Texas law requires you to do. The first one is smoke alarms. Well, this is a temporary lease, so you don't have to go in and make sure there's smoke alarms all over this house. Hopefully they were already there. But if they're not, it's not your responsibility. 2, security devices. Typically, as a landlord, you change the locks as every new person comes in. These people already live there, so you're absolved of the having to change the locks at this point. It goes on to say at 23, consult your attorney. Real estate licensees cannot give legal advice. This lease is intended to be legally binding. Read it carefully. If you do not understand the effect of the lease, consult your attorney before signing. 24, all notices from one part to the other must be in writing and are effective when mailed to, hand-delivered, or transmitted by fax or electronic transmission as follows, and you have the landlord and the tenant here, and everyone signs it. So that is your seller's temporary residential lease. I will tell you that there is one for the buyer to also have a temporary lease. I strongly advise you not to use this document unless you just have to. And you really need to check with your broker and see if they're okay with it. So there's a way for the buyer to move in prior to the closing. A lot of things can go on there that are unforeseen, and just the buyer getting in there and realizing you got a squeaky door, or this doesn't work as what you thought it was going to work like. You've just opened up a can of worms that do you really need to do that? The buyer temporary lease reads exactly like the seller temporary lease does, and it's just one I recommend you just don't use unless there is no other resolution, short of them staying in a hotel until they can get this thing closed and work it properly. This is one of my favorite forms. Buyers walk through an acceptance form. Not many agents use it, and every agent should use it. It just kind of covers everybody here. Notice to buyer. The contract provides that the seller will deliver possession of the property to the buyer in its present or required condition, ordinary wear and tear accepted. Before closing, the buyer should verify that the condition of the property meets the terms of the contract, meaning you should be doing a walkthrough before you go sign papers, because at the closing table, you sign a document saying you have agreed to buy this property. The title company is not obligated to go walk through it, nor will they. It's your obligation to go make sure that what you're buying is what you thought you were buying. So number one, inspections. The property was inspected by an inspector or inspectors of buyer's choice. Buyer has reviewed the inspection report. 2, buyer chose not to have a property inspected. Why would you do that? B, before closing walkthrough. 1, the buyer has walked through and reviewed the property before closing, and you put a date on there of when you did that. 2, the buyer chose not to walk through or review the property prior to closing. 3, C, acceptance. Buyer accepts the property in its present condition. In bold, notice to buyer. The brokers have no knowledge of any defects in the property other than what has been disclosed in the seller's disclosure notice or other written information the broker may have provided. The broker has no duty to inspect the property for unknown defects. It is the buyer's responsibility to have the inspections completed. You can see why this is an important form. All right, our next addendum is non-realty item addendum. You remember at the very beginning, way back when, the first page of your contract, it had a list of everything that stayed with the property. And underneath it, it had an exception, meaning what the seller wanted to keep. They were not going to get rid of. For example, the chandelier or the drapes in the bedroom. Those were things that would have been excluded. This is how a buyer includes certain things, like maybe a TV or the refrigerator, those kind of things. So let's read and see what it says. A, for an additional sum of blank and other good and valuable consideration, the seller shall convey to buyer at closing the following personal property. Specify each item carefully, include description, model numbers, serial numbers, location, and other information. And then it has this long space that you can add a lot of things. So let's just start with, say, the refrigerator. Well, do you want the refrigerator in the kitchen that's really pretty and stainless steel, or do you want the one that's crummy and in the garage? So you want to be very specific. The stainless steel refrigerator currently in the kitchen, you want to be that specific on this. The washer and dryer currently on property, the TV over the fireplace, those kind of things. Because in our exclusions back at the beginning, it said that the TV mount would stay, but not the TV. So it's those kind of things. The mirror in the bathroom that's on a hook. Well, at the beginning it said that the mirror stays. Yep, that's an arguable point. So why make someone disappointed? Let's write it down. When in doubt, write it down. So the mirror in the powder room, the fireplace screen, the fountain in the backyard, whatever those things are, the pot rack over the kitchen that makes that kitchen just adorable. Those are the things that you want to write in here. Don't leave it to a question. Don't leave it to someone being disappointed when they move in. Let's get it written down. But the thing I like most about this document is B and C. B, the seller represents and warrants that the seller owns the personal property described in paragraph A, free and clear of all encumbrances. Well, wouldn't it be good to know that they weren't making payments on that refrigerator and they really didn't own it? Absolutely. So this clears that up. And C, seller does not warrant or guarantee the condition or future performance of the personal property conveyed in this document. If it lasts for a day, if it lasts for 20 years, it's not up to the seller. They did all they could do. They turned it over to the buyer, and what happens, happens. So it's a really good document that everyone should be using if the buyer wants to keep certain things. Okay, the next addendum, addendum for sale of other property by buyer, we think of as a contingency, or a contingency contract is what we've now gone into. That's how we think of this. But this is the addendum that you would use. And this one's a little bit tricky, so it'll take us a bit to get through this one. The contract is contingent upon the buyer's receipt of the proceeds from the sale of their property at, and you put the property address of what they're selling, on or before a certain date. So let's just arguably say August 1st right now so that we have something we can kind of tie into. That's now called the contingency. If the contingency is not satisfied or waived by the buyer by the above date, the contract will terminate automatically and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So what we're saying here is the buyer wants to buy this house. So they've got to sell their house first before they can buy the new house. That's not uncommon. Many people have to sell to buy. They need the proceeds from this house to buy that house. Very common for us to have that happen. So you're going to put the date here of what their contract is set for, what their house is going to close for. So let's just say that it's going to close on August 1st. That's the way this is written. And then it says, note, the date inserted in this paragraph should be no later than the closing date specified in paragraph 9 of the contract. Well, paragraph 9 of the contract is the closing date of the new house. So if this one was closing on August 1st, you couldn't have the new house closing before that. Why? Because they need the funds from that to get to this one, right? So the closing date in the new contract must be August 1st or later. It's got to be after that so that we have the funds to buy the new house. That's how this is going to work. B, if seller accepts a written offer to sell the property, seller shall notify the buyer, 1, of such acceptance, and 2, that the seller requires the buyer to waive the contingency. Buyer must waive the contingency on or before blank number of days after the seller's notice to the buyer. Otherwise, the contract will terminate automatically and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Well, there's a document for that. There's a document to tell the buyer that you've received another offer. But this is how it works. The home stays on the under contract and is moving along. They're doing their inspections, they're doing everything. That buyer is moving along. But they still have to sell their home, right? They still need that money. So we have that listed as AK in our MLS. It's an active knockout, meaning a new buyer can come in and knock that buyer out. So here's how that's going to look. New buyer comes along and says, I love this house. Seller, I want to buy it. They write a contract. They work that contract until it's ready to go to the title company. But it's got to be a backup for just a minute. Can't sell the same house to two people, can you? So you can't have a contract with buyer number 2 and a contract with buyer number 1. That's not going to go over very well. So buyer number 2 is kind of sitting on a shelf for just a minute while they go back to buyer number 1 and say, hey, buyer number 1, what do you want to do? We've got a great contract that we want to accept. Are you willing to drop your contingency and move forward to closing? And then here are the rules of that road that we're going to talk about right now. So that's the scenario that we're discussing. Another buyer's come along. They're trying to knock out buyer number 1. So this said that they're going to come to buyer number 1 and give them so many days to decide what to do. Well, you don't want to keep those guys hanging for too long, buyer number 2, or they'll go away, right? So we want buyer number 1 to make a decision pretty quickly. So maybe 2-3 days that you want to give them to make a decision. I mean, quite frankly, they either can or they can't drop the contingency. They either have enough faith that their buyer's going to buy their home or they don't. It's pretty simple at this point. It's not really up for question. So they've given them, say, 2 or 3 days to make that election to move forward or not. C, buyer may waive the contingency only by notifying the seller of the waiver and depositing blank more dollars with the escrow agent as additional earnest money. All notices must be in writing and are effective when delivered in accordance with the contract. D, if the buyer waives the contingency and fails to close and fund solely due to the buyer's non-receipt of the proceeds from the buyer's sale of property described in paragraph A, buyer will be in default. If such default occurs, seller may exercise the remedies in paragraph 15 of the contract. And if we remember, paragraph 15 was the default paragraph. E, for purposes of this addendum, time is of the essence, and strict compliance with the times for performance stated herein is required. So again, very strong language that we don't have any wiggle room here. The dates are the dates. So the buyer number 1, has all the rights in the contract. They have their option period, they have their financing period. Once those are over, the buyer has no more outs in this contract by saying, I can't, the seller knew I couldn't buy the house until I sold mine, so I'm going to get out because of financing. That is not the case. Once their financing time, and if you remember, there was a time period to get your financing in the third-party financing. Once that's over, you're kind of floating in no man's land here, and that's when the buyer could be in default. So you can't use the excuse, oh, I couldn't sell our house and therefore I still can't buy yours. That excuse is over, and that's what this document is saying. Well, you remember it said that we're going to give you notice. So here's what's going to happen next. So here comes the next step. Notices regarding contingency under addendum for sale of other property by buyer. So we told them we had to give them a notice, and here it is. Typically, in our contracts, if we've said there has to be a notice, then you will find that there is a notice here that is promulgated for you. So, seller, we write that down. The buyer, we write that down. The contract concerning the property at, and we list the property that we are under contract for. Seller's notice to buyer of removal of contingency. 1, seller has accepted another written offer to purchase the property. 2, buyer may waive the contingency by notifying the seller in writing of the waiver and depositing any required additional earnest money with the escrow agent within the time required under the addendum for sale of other property by buyer. 3, if the buyer does not waive the contingency and deposit the additional earnest money within the time required, the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. And the seller signs and dates that. And we send it over to the buyer. Here's the buyer's response to the seller's notice to remove the contingency. 1, buyer waives the contingency and deposits additional earnest money with the escrow agent. Or 2, the buyer does not waive the contingency, the contract is terminated, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. And the buyer signs it. So that either releases the house so that buyer number 2 can now step into first position, or they decide to move forward and buyer number 2 just sits in a backup position until this closes or doesn't close. So that's how that goes through the whole contingency for sale of other property. This is the addendum for property subject to a mandatory membership in a property owners association. In parentheses underneath, it says not for use with a condominium. This is addendum concerning property at, and you write down the property address. So this is going to be for a townhome or a home, an actual single family home that's in a homeowners association. So when you drive into a neighborhood for selling a home and there's brick walls and there's a pool over here and a playground and a clubhouse, you can pretty much assume you are now in a property owners association, because who's going to take care of that, right? So it's public property, and it's the homeowners there that now are part owners in that. So that's what you want to look at. This is not for a condo. That's very important that you understand that. A, subdivision information. Subdivision information means a current copy of the restrictions applying to the subdivision and bylaws and rules of the association, and 2, a resale certificate, all of which are described in the section of Texas Property Code. Check one box. 1. Within blank number of days of the effective date of the contract, the seller shall obtain, pay for, and deliver the subdivision information to the buyer. If seller delivers the subdivision information, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after they receive the subdivision information, or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If the buyer does not receive the subdivision information, buyer, as buyer's sole remedy, may terminate the contract at any time prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Well, the homeowner associations have legally 10 days to get these documents to you. So at a minimum, 10 days needs to go in this blank. But I will tell you that sometimes it's very difficult to get, or timely, to get the homeowner documents from these associations. So putting 12 or 15 days in there is not unreasonable. So this goes on to say that at the end of that 15 or 10 days or whatever you put in there, if the buyer has not received those documents, they can go all the way to closing and then terminate. So it's really important that your date in there is something that you can achieve. 2, within blank number of days of the effective date, the buyer shall obtain and pay for and deliver the copy of the subdivision information to the seller. If the buyer obtains the subdivision information within the time required, the buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after the buyer receives the subdivision information, or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If the buyer, due to factors beyond buyer's control, is not able to obtain the subdivision information within the time required, buyer may, as buyer's sole remedy, terminate the contract within 3 days after the time required, or prior to closing, whichever occurs first, and the earnest money will be refunded. 3, buyer has received and approved the subdivision information before signing the contract. Buyer does or does not, it's a checkbox, does not require an updated resale certificate. If the buyer requires an updated resale certificate, seller, at buyer's expense, shall deliver it to the buyer within 10 days after receiving payment for the updated resale certificate from the buyer. Buyer may terminate this contract, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer if the seller fails to deliver the updated resale certificate within the time required. Or 4, buyer doesn't require the delivery of the subdivision information at all. Well, why might that be? Maybe they already live there. Maybe they're buying a second property there. They already have the subdivision information. They don't need it. So the resale certificate, to understand that, is the title company needs that resale certificate to be recent. Like, are there any new liens or assessments? Is there any legal proceedings going on at the property, which we'll see in just a minute. But basically, they need that to be no more than 90 days old. So it may be that the title company requires an updated certificate so that they have updated information on this property. In bold, the title company or its agent is authorized to act on behalf of the parties to obtain the subdivision information only upon receipt of the required fee for the subdivision information from the party obligated to pay. So what that means is the title company is willing to do your work for you. They just want the money before they do it, because I think too many title companies got hung out to dry when they ordered all of these documents and paid for them, and then the property didn't close or whatever happened there, and so they're left holding the bag on money that they never received. So now title company's willing to do it. They just want the money before they do it. B, material changes. If the seller becomes aware of any material changes in the subdivision information, seller shall promptly give notice to the buyer. Buyer may terminate the contract prior to closing by giving written notice to the seller if 1, any of the subdivision information provided was not true, 2, any material adverse change in the subdivision information occurred prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. Well, what might happen there? Let's say that you had your homeowner association meeting and they decided to put an assessment on the homeowner fees for 2 years to pay for a new pool or a new roof or whatever a homeowner might need to do. So instead of paying $250 a month in homeowner fees, and that's what the buyer was thinking, you're now going to pay $350 for the next 2 years. Well, that changes everything for a buyer. That may push a buyer out of the ability to buy that property. So any change that happens in that subdivision, that information has to immediately go to the buyer, and the buyer has the right to walk away, especially if it's going to adversely hurt him, financially or otherwise. C, fees. Except as provided by A, D, and E, buyers shall pay any and all association fees or other charges associated with the transfer of the property, not to exceed blank, and the seller shall pay the excess. So you can put whatever you want to in there. How much is the buyer willing to pay? Now, don't confuse these two things. This is for the transfer, if there is a transfer fee. Some homeowner associations have it, some don't. But if they did have one, how would this be split? 50-50, $50 from the buyer, the rest from the seller. However, whatever you want to put there, it's up to the buyer what he wants to do there. But do not confuse this with the payment for the homeowner documents that we talked about earlier. That's one thing. The transfer fee is another thing. Got two different issues here. Don't confuse those two issues. D, deposits for reserves. Buyers shall pay any deposits for reserves required at closing by the association. A lot of associations, because it takes them a while to get the new person into the system, will require 2 or 3 months homeowner fees ahead of time so that they kind of have that already sitting there until they can get the buyer in the system and get bills out to them or whatever needs to happen there. So that's not uncommon. So when a buyer thinks that their closing costs are going to be X, it might turn out to be higher than that because these homeowner fees that you didn't realize were going to be added to their closing cost. Well, the good news is they aren't going to have to pay those later, but it does make for some upfront costs that they may or may not have thought was going to come. E, authorization. Seller authorizes the association to release and provide the subdivision information and any updated resale certificate if requested by the buyer, the title company, or any broker to this sale. If buyer does not require the subdivision information or an updated resale certificate, and the title company requires the information from the association, such as the status of dues, special assessments, violations of covenants of restrictions, and a waiver of any right of first refusal, the seller or the buyer, checkbox, shall pay the title company the cost of obtaining the information prior to the title company obtaining that information. So again, if the title company needs any updates, who's going to pay for it? And we need the money before we get it. Notice to buyer regarding repairs by the association. If the association may have the sole responsibility to make certain repairs to the property, if you are concerned about the condition of any part of the property which the association is required to repair, you should not sign the contract unless you are satisfied that the association will make the desired repairs. Well, the hard part about that one is you may not know that there was some rotted wood or the balcony was a little bit loose or whatever, and you may not find that out till after inspections. So that would be your time to go to the association and say, we want these things repaired, and the association might say, fine, we'll do it, but I would suggest that you find out exactly when they're going to do it so that the association has agreed to paint the rotted wood or fix the balcony or whatever it is that you wanted them to do, and a date specific that will be done. Because otherwise, just because they said it was going to be done, could be 7 years from now for all I know, right? So you might want to be a little more specific with the homeowner association at that point. One last document that can go along with the mandatory membership in a property owners association is actually a resale certificate that was provided for us and promulgated. Now, I will tell you that most associations use their own forms. They're not required to use this form. You just want the information. However you can get it, you just want the information. But what I really like about this form is it talks about, is it a first right of refusal? What's the current assessments? It's got all of the questions that you would logically want to ask. But at the very bottom, at the very last paragraph, it says, these are the required attachments that we want. We want the restrictions, the rules, the bylaws, the current balance sheet, the current operating budget, certificate of insurance. That's really important because your lender's going to want that. Because your homeowner association has their own liability insurance policy on top of what you might have. And any governmental notices of health or housing. So this one just gives a very specific list of things that you're going to want. And so that's why I like to include it when I send my contract over. Might they use it? Maybe, maybe not, but at least it gives a list of everything that the buyer's going to want. And there's no signatures here, so it's not like anyone's signing off on it. It's just a matter of we're asking for these documents.